everyone, I'm Allie with PotomacBeads. In this Better Beader episode, I am going to answer a lot of simple questions, give a lot of hints and tricks and tips for starting and working with basic flat peyote stitch. When I do the different live events as well as the different videos working in our customer care department, we get a lot of contacts about peyote stitch, which is a very basic stitch, but sometimes can be a little bit tricky for people, especially if they're trying to follow a pattern, a design, as well as roll them out into a rounded bead like the sorbet or the waterfall that I just did on the Facebook Live. So I thought this would be a great opportunity for this Better Beader episode to answer some questions and give some tips that I think are really helpful if you're struggling to learn peyote stitch. Simple peyote is really, really easy to learn when you start with easy beads. There's many different versions that you can do, rounding them out like the seed bead tubes that you can create, doing them in a pattern to create an American flag, creating a free-form peyote where you're using different sizes, or even like this snake skin, using a 2-hole super duo to create your peyote stitch. It's very easy to get started peyote, but sometimes jumping into projects, even like these fringe, the ribbon earrings here, may confuse you if you're not completely set and knowing of your peyote stitch. I always recommend when you are doing a new stitch, if you come across a pattern like this multi-drop bracelet in the peyote pebbles, or you're coming in and doing the snakeskin one, or even rounding them out to tubes like the peyote tubes. You want to start by learning the basic stitch first. So how do you learn the basic stitch before you go in and do all of these variants on this even count flat peyote? I'm going to be bringing over here on my bead board 2 different beads here that I have. I have 8 OC beads. I want to start with a larger bead when I'm getting started because I don't want to start with tiny beads. It's going to frustrate me, be harder to see. I even suggest sometimes starting with cubes or 6 OC beads like this peyote piece here to help you know exactly where you're going. For this stitch, you want to put on a stop bead that's not attached to the project. Make this a sample piece. If it ends up being a completed piece, that's amazing, but don't go into it with that mindset. Go into it with the mindset that I'm going to pick up working with 2 colors every other bead. You want it long enough so that you know how to establish the stitch, but you don't want it so long that you get frustrated because it takes forever. So here I have 4 of my darker beads and then 4 of my lighter beads. And I'm doing 8 beads total. This is going to be 8 beads wide. So that's how you're going to look at this and practice. You're going to think, all right, this is 8 beads wide. The width is going to be measured by a certain amount of beads. So this is 8 beads wide. And then the length is going to be measured by the amount of rows that you do. So if you're looking at a pattern for, say, the wavy American flag bracelet, you know exactly how many long it's going to be. So this one here I think is 10 or 8 long. And then however many rows long, so it's wide, 8 or 10 wide versus how many rows. When counting rows of peyote stitch, you're going to count every other bead on that starter line to know how many beads you're starting with. And then you're going to count along the edge here to figure out the total length that you're working with. I did this in the Facebook Live, showing you how to make and understand some patterns if you're working with a peyote stitch. What I always find helpful is when you're starting to have another needle handy. I'm going to go into the peyote stitch, and the reason I'm using 2 different colors is to keep track of my beads. I'm going to grab 1 more of the same color, and then I'm going to sew through the second bead there, which we're going to say we're coming out of bead 8, and we're going to sew through bead number 7. Give a nice tight pull, and when you're getting started, get that first bead in row number 3. What's row number 3 established? Your first row of your 8 beads are rows 1 and 2. We are now doing row 3. I'm going to add a bead, skip a bead. So I have a bunch of basic peyote stitch videos, and this is just a helpful hint to go along with it. So we'll put some links, and make sure if you want to in the comments, give us some feedback on your favorite peyote projects to get started with, as well as really helping out the beading community that watches these Better Beaders and have them do some useful and helpful hints. All right, so I have my Peyote Stitch established now. One thing that happens to a lot of people is they'll get an initial wave to it. What's happening is sometimes you're going to rotate which beads are on the first row versus the third row. In order to keep it flat and established so it doesn't turn inside of that single bead, grab another needle and sew through what is now your first row. Just let it hang out there, piece of wire and needle, and now you have something to hold on to as well to get that peyote stitch started. As you go to row 2, whatever bead you're coming out of, so I'm coming out of bead number 1 there, I'm going to sew down now. The thread's always going to switch directions and reverse. You're going to, once you start out with your 8 beads, every time after that is going to be a total of 4 beads. Once you have those 4 beads on, you're coming out of the alternate color, so this is why I like to use 2, and this will get me lines. You're going to then pick up the next color, once again sewing up through the top. You want to keep your tension nice and even, because if I pull too tightly one way versus the other way, you're going to actually get a waving effect where it's starting to pull one direction or another. If you want to, a trick and a hint that you can do is if you prefer to sew towards you or away from you, I prefer to sew away from me. So I'm going to finish this row here. And then once I finish this row, I'm going to take this big stop bead, which I use so you could see if I'm at the start or finish, and I'm going to flip it in my hand. So I still have that needle there helping me out, holding on to row number 1. And now I can sew away from me. So I'm always sewing away from me. That's going to make it faster for me because that's the way that I'm most comfortable sewing. Again, when I get to the end of the row then, I'll flip it. So that way again, I'm sewing away from me as I add my right rows or white row. You can see this is going to just speed up that process because you're always doing that same fluid motion. When it gets to a pattern like this, with the earrings that I have on, and I made these are 2-drop peyote. You can have fun creating a pattern by using 2 and 2 beads at a time. So here is, instead of 1 bead, she's adding 2 beads for 2-drop. I have another explanation in a Better Beader episode talking about 1 versus 2-drop versus 3 and so forth and so on. So check that out as well. When you are establishing a pattern like this here, you can always go back, remove the needle from this row, and sew up the end using some 15s if you want to hide that thread. So I can remove this needle, take this tail if I left enough, and sew back through using smaller beads to make them even. That's going to be a nice way to finish off the edge. So when I go into some of these projects here, like this snakeskin one, you can see at the end, you've added just 11 seed beads to close that off. The reason I added 11 O's is because that is going to line up pretty perfectly with the end of the piece. So generally speaking, you'll go back after doing your peyote and learning it, take that thread or the stop bead off the thread and fill in these holes with extra beads, usually of a smaller size. Some other little important tips when you're doing your peyote stitch is all about tension. Again, you want to make sure that as you're working on it, you pull it evenly. And again, it helps if you're sewing in the same direction, flipping it in your hand, so you're always sewing either away from you or towards you, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. If you don't like the bridge threads going along the side of the peyote stitch here, you can always add an 11O before turning back and doing your next row. Once again, I add an 11O, and then you can pick up another one of your 8O seed beads and sew and start the next row. When you sew and start the next row in this, then that 11O just is going to sit off to the side and help to block that thread end from showing. You'll notice when you're doing this that you're going to have this seed bead at every single intersections if you're using that in the design and you have that 11 row that you want to establish to cover the lines. To look at the peyote also, you want to be able to know if you are working lengthwise or if you are working widthwise. When you're doing a bracelet form, it's always great to work this way, going length. If you would start out totally working on the bottom here and then building up, there's chances that you can get that curve happening. Your beads would be sitting in a different direction, but you could do a long piece where my starter row, the beads would be turned the other way, but my starter row would be the length of this simple peyote stitch bracelet here. Again, 6 O's in cubes, great way to start out. Once you're done your stitch or your pattern, you can look and see how many rows you've done. We know our width is 8 wide because we started off with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 beads. If we want to know how many rows our length is, you're going to count 2 rows at a time. So you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I'm 11 rows long by 4 rows, or by 8 rows wide. Now, it's interesting because of the way that they sit, that this does not look like this section here that's 11 long is going to look wider than my 8. It's because you're fitting in 2 rows of every other bead. I have a couple videos that I'm including down in the actual description of the video to link to, so you can play around with making diamonds. You can look at the different ways to do freeform. You can look at how to do those gaps as well. And then I'll have some more videos coming out on working with tubular peyote and working with some of these rolled over tubes as well. But one thing to make sure is, again, tension is correct. You can flip from one side to the other to help do that. Pick alternating or different contrasting colors so that way you can play around to create your own designs, to get comfortable of which beads you're adding. Once you begin and get comfortable, go ahead and you can cover up your bridge threads if you don't want to see all that thread poking along the bottom. And then you can start to even roll and sew the ends together. So if I have this odd count here, I can go in, make it even, because I have 11 rows. I'm going to need 1 more row. And the awesome thing about peyote is I can come over anywhere that I want to and connect the peyote stitch. Grab a couple more beads here from off screen. Sew 1 more row up to help you realize that these line up perfectly. So your peyote goal, when you're finished with it, is that if you look at your peyote stitch piece, you can roll it together and it fits perfectly like a puzzle piece. It would fit seamlessly together in that tube shape and you wouldn't see any start or end. Also know that the way that the peyote sits, you can easily sew back and add thread, sewing along your line here so you don't see any extra thread. And just the way that the peyote stitch sits, if I sew back different ways, it pretty much locks the thread in place. I don't have to worry about sewing back an inch, then I don't have to worry about knotting it. I can just take my thread zap or thread burner and burn down the thread edge here, weave another piece back in. Again, at the end here, if you want to, you can add those smaller beads to create a nice area for you to put on the clasp, or you can come right out from the bead. If you look here too, once you advance, you can do 2-drop or 3-drop peyote. I have examples of that. Or you can add like these ruffled ribbon earrings. You can add more rows to the bottom than you add to the top of your peyote stitch to get all different looks and really expand on your skills. There's so many different peyote based videos. Again, we're going to put a couple underneath. You can even post in the comments and let us know your favorite peyote video or your favorite design element, or again, really some tips and tricks that you want to use. With the peyote stitch as well, at any point, you can round this over and attach it to the rows below to get a nice turned over section, just like Jenny did here, creating that peyote hanger, where your peyote, when stitched together, should have a seamless line that you can't actually tell where it started or where it stopped. Once you get great with that flat, easy peyote stitch, then you can teach yourself, design on your own, and really play around with learning some of these awesome different stitches and patterns that go along with basic peyote stitch. As always, thanks so much for joining me in this Better Beader episode. I can't wait to see everybody's helpful hints that they list below in the comments. There are sure ways that you have maybe messed up on the Peyote Stitch and learned from it, as well as helpful ways to keep track of the rows that you're on, keep track of the lines, and determine how to change up beads, adding ones in, and what patterns you love. If you want to, you can also post in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making your favorite flat peyote stitch pattern and some things you learned along the way. Beading, just like anything, is something that the more you do it, the more you experiment, the more you answer your own questions and solve your own mistakes, the easier it is to take and expand your craft and your knowledge. As always, these Better Beader episodes really are meant to make you a better beader and to help you in this amazing craft. The great thing that we have, again, with that feedback in the comments, is an amazing community to share all of your successes and failures even that can be learned from in those comments. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully this episode helps you to get back to that peyote stitch, learn peyote stitch, or finally sit down to conquer how to do some designs and get an idea of switching up patterns and beads to create and to get yourself ready to do some of those more complex peyote patterns. As always, if you need any materials, you can check us out online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. We are happy to help you with your craft addiction. As always, thanks so much for joining, and enjoy and happy beading.